How's it going, class? Welcome back. We're going to be doing another bonus lecture here. As I always say, make sure you have any questions, talk to me. If you're not getting the concept in the course, if you're not understanding what's going on, if there's certain concepts that you're kind of stuck or falling behind on, don't feel bad, right? This is some people's first physiology course, so they might be struggling a little bit to understand what's going on, as well as they might not have as good a refresher of anatomy, so it gets a little bit harder if you start falling behind. So I highly recommend you try to stay on top of things. Here is a resource to help you out, since you can't really help people or ask people in class, and you can't ask me after class. Try to reach out through email, whatever you say. I know I'm saying this multiple times, but I'm just trying to be here, be the best resource for you guys, so that you can understand what's going on in this course. Because, like I said, I think this material is really important, and I like teaching it. So I'll do my best to help you out. Okay, so we'll jump into the lecture here. Seconds. All right, we're going to be looking at blood flow again. And the reason I want to go over this is because certain people will understand, they'll understand that, oh, your lungs take in oxygen and the oxygen is used by the muscles, or the oxygen is transported by the red blood cells, right? But the step-by-step process and kind of the long overarching idea of what occurs seems to get lost in some people. So I wanted to make sure that we're going over this and so you guys are understanding, so that you know essentially why you're breathing and what that breathing is doing to help your exercising, and essentially also just to help keep you alive, right? Not breathing, right? You're not doing so well. So we'll first talk about our air pressure, right? So air pressure is a can be thought of as just the total amount of air particles. So if there is more air particles in this tube than there is in this tube, based on Avogadro's law, there's going to be more pressure there. So more particles means more pressure. And the concentration of the air is always the same no matter what elevation you're at. So look over here. I know this graph is a little cut off, but that blue there, that blue in that pie chart, that's nitrogen. Most of the atmosphere is nitrogen. I said this in the last lecture. And the green there is oxygen. Most people think the atmosphere is mostly oxygen. It's actually mostly nitrogen. When you get to a higher elevation, these concentrations stay the same. Nitrogen is still 70-ish%, 78% or something like that. Oxygen is still about 20%, okay? What happens is the total amount of those particles becomes less, but proportionally so. So there's less nitrogen, there's less oxygen, there's less carbon dioxide. Everything else, everything in the atmosphere is less. So there's less atmospheric pressure around you to drive the air into your lungs. And how you get the air to be driven into your lungs is through diaphragm contraction. You can see here this green line right here. That is essentially the written out, the drawn out diaphragm. And when it contracts like it is now, hopefully this time is syncing up, contracting now, right? And then once more it's contracting. Hopefully that's syncing up with the video that you guys are seeing. I don't know if it will. I think it will. But as the diaphragm goes through contraction, it actually expands the lungs. It pulls on the lungs, pulling them open. And when it pulls those lungs open, it pulls air in. It's kind of like a baster. If you've ever squeezed a baster and then released it, you can literally hear the air rush in. Or if you put the baster in, let's say, turkey gravy to spritz over your dinner on Thanksgiving, the baster itself, when you release that bulb, is pulling in whatever you want to, be it whether that be air or that be a liquid. The same thing is happening here. You're expanding the volume of the lungs, you're expanding the volume of the baster, which causes a drop in pressure within the lungs or within the baster, and it draws things into it. Things want to move down their concentration gradient or down their pressure gradient, just like we'll talk about in a little bit here in diffusion. So the process by which you draw air into the lungs is an active process. The diaphragm is contracting, is pulling air into the lungs. At rest, expiration is actually a relaxation process. So you're not actually forcing the air out at rest. All that's happening is the diaphragm is relaxing and the lungs have an elastic recoil that's pushing the air back out. Now, with exercise, more intra-abdominal and interthoracic muscles get involved in inspiration and expiration. But at rest, it's really just a contraction of the diaphragm and then the relaxation of the diaphragm that is causing your breath. So we're not going to talk about intrapulmonary pressure in this course. It's not super important for exercise. If you are a cardiologist or a cardiorespiratory inclined individual, you might be looking at those things, but we're not going to for this course. So now we've got the air into the lungs. where does it go? What happens? Well, the air is going to move right into our trachea here, into our trachea, down into our greater bronchioles, into our lesser bronchioles, and they're going to move into our alveoli here. And these alveoli are just like the end. They're the dead ends. These are the little sacs that have vasculature weaved around them, like we can see in these two images here. These capillaries are weaved around these alveoli around very, very thin membranes that allow for readily available oxygen and carbon dioxide diffusion. And so, just like we said before, if there is a higher pressure or a higher concentration of something, it's going to flow down its concentration gradient. So in the alveoli, you just breathe in atmospheric air. So more than likely, as you should understand, there's going to be a higher concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere than in your body. That's why we breathe it. That's why we need it. So the oxygen is going to flow from these alveoli. It's going to flow from the alveoli into the capillary bed. And here we can see the little gradient where the deoxygenated blood is slowly becoming oxygenated as it goes across the alveoli, and then it leaves through a small arterial or capillary. So the oxygen is getting there as well as the carbon dioxide itself. The carbon dioxide is being released. So not only is the blood picking up oxygen as it goes through the alveoli, but this deoxygenated blood here again is actually releasing carbon dioxide into the alveoli so that you can breathe it out as it goes back up the bronchiole, trachea, and then out of your mouth, and that's your expiration, okay? So breathing is a dynamic process, and these things always have to occur in tandem. When you breathe in, you're going to be breathing in atmospheric air within the alveoli. You have diffusion of oxygen into the blood, and you have carbon dioxide diffusing out of the blood. Now, how the oxygen is then picked up by the blood is due to hemoglobin, specifically on your red blood cells. Red blood cells are the cells in your bloodstream that pick up and transport oxygen. And they can do this because they have these small hemoglobin groups. These are structured proteins that are made specifically for carrying oxygens. On these little hemoglobin molecules, they have what are called heme groups. And these heme groups are these oxygen and iron groups here, really just the iron group. So each little hemoglobin protein molecule can hold up to 4 oxygen molecules, as well as those heme protein molecules, excuse me, those heme iron pieces of the hemoglobin molecule can also hold in the carbon dioxide and transport the carbon dioxide from the muscle back to the lungs. So they have a dual purpose. Obviously, the primary purpose of them is to carry oxygen, but they do have a dual purpose. And so if you've ever heard of anemia, that's why anemia is so detrimental, is because anemia is a lack of iron or a lack of red blood cells. So if you have a lack of red blood cells, and specifically the heme groups, you're going to have a much harder time carrying oxygen to the working muscle, and therefore you're going to feel lethargic, you're not going to be able to exercise as intensely, and it may have some detriment on your just general standard daily living tasks. Now getting it to the muscles. So now we know, right? We know that this has gotten into the capillaries and now it's getting into the arteries. It's going to go back to the heart and then be pumped around the rest of the body. And so once it's pumped around the rest of the body, right, we want the blood moving to the muscles. So oxygenated blood is transported via arteries. Remember specifically, that's a little bit of a misnomer. Oxygenated blood doesn't make an artery. What an artery is just anything that moves away from the heart. But for the most part, most arteries carry oxygenated blood. So a similar process that occurred in the alveoli, that diffusion, occurs in the muscles. So as you can imagine that there is a muscle, right? There's a muscle right here. Oh, got a little scratchy at the end, but you can imagine that there is a muscle right here. What is happening is the arterioles are divvying up that blood to the capillary beds. Once it gets into the muscle, and this little red squiggly here that we drew, the muscle is then going to be drawing in the oxygen, like you see here in this bottom right picture. Is drawing in the oxygen as well as the carbon dioxide is being released from the muscle. So the muscle is what is stimulating the draw in of this oxygen. So there's just a readily available supply of oxygen in the blood, essentially. And depending on how much oxygen the muscle is using, that's going to dictate how much or oxygen it draws in. Remember, your body doesn't really need to put an effort for anything that's not necessary. So it's not going to be putting in effort, essentially. It's not going to be making transporters and making available oxygen transport if it's not required. So the oxygen is transporting across the muscle cell. If the muscle cell is more active and using more oxygen, it's going to stimulate the release and the diffusion of even more oxygen. And that makes sense, right? If you're working harder, your muscles are requiring more oxygen, it would make sense that they're also drawing in more oxygen for those metabolic needs. As well as if your muscles are working harder, you're going to be producing more carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is going to be released back into the bloodstream. And that'll be what we talk about AVO2 difference. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Remember that there are also ways to, or training will improve this oxygen delivery. So training, or specifically mostly aerobic training, will improve cardiac output, so the amount of blood that your heart is pumping out per minute. It also increase your red blood cell and hemoglobin counts. So specifically, it's helping you improve your hemoglobin counts by improving red blood cell counts as well. So this is going to allow you a greater capacity to carry oxygen to the working muscle. Now we see here this AVO2 difference. What that is saying is that it's saying the oxygen difference from the arterial side to the venous side. So the oxygen difference from the arterial side to the venous side. So if that difference is larger, let's say it goes from, and I apologize for the drawing here again, bear with me, I'm drawing on a number pad here, a laptop pad. If it goes from 100 to 60, okay, then you could say that the partial pressure that's been taken out of oxygen is 40. Okay, so either you're not working hard, okay, you're not working that hard, or the oxygen delivery, the oxygen diffusion in this muscular bed is not very efficient. So after training, after a certain amount of activity, let's say you just ran a mile, okay, if you've been aerobically training for the last year, now you compare it again, you might see the oxygen partial pressure in the venous side to be 50. So even though you're doing the same exact amount of work, your body has gotten more efficient at extracting the oxygen that's available to it, so you're better able to produce the force and the work that you want to do for your exercise. And I'm hoping that makes sense. Essentially, what's happening is because the muscles are drawing in more oxygen, they are better able to produce force and jobs, okay? And then finally, you have blood volume, and blood volume is just increasing. This is allowing for greater transport of all these things, much like we're talking about with the red blood cell and the hemoglobin groups, okay? So now the oxygen has moved into the muscle. People often forget, what is it used for? Where does it go? I'll ask this in my assessments class. They'll say, okay, what is the oxygen used for? Okay, it's for exercise. I go, but specifically where? And people will not know, even though we just spent an entire lecture talking about the oxidative system and aerobic respiration. And so we see here, we see glycolysis. As we should remember, does glycolysis use oxygen? No, it doesn't, right? Glycolysis does not use oxygen. Glycolysis is an anaerobic process. But what does use oxygen? Well, the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain uses oxygen, okay? As well as the Krebs cycle to some capacity. So the aerobic metabolism is occurring where? What does this little drawing look like? Well, mitochondria, right? The powerhouse of the cells, we all should know. Should have learned 3 things in elementary school, right? You should have learned that if boys like girls, they hate them and they pick on them. You should have learned the Pythagorean theorem, and you should have learned that mitochondria is powerhouse of the cell, right? So in the mitochondria, okay, this process of the Krebs cycle electron transport chain is what is utilizing the oxygen. And this might be obvious for some of you, but for some of you, this may be the first time you're hearing this. The oxygen that you're breathing in is going to the mitochondria to be utilized to produce ATP. And from that process, you get water, but you also get carbon dioxide here, okay? You get carbon dioxide. And so if you think about this, this is just the opposite of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis requires water and requires carbon dioxide and produces oxygen. Well, this is respiration. This is internal respiration. So this is the opposite. It requires oxygen, produces water, and produces carbon dioxide. So the oxygen that we are breathing in is being utilized by the mitochondria. And imagine if we have more mitochondria, or the mitochondria are larger or more efficient at their job, they're probably going to be able to utilize more oxygen, which means if they're utilizing more oxygen, they're making more ATP. More ATP for exercise means a greater exercise output, which means a better time in your race or whatever it might be. So the basis of what we were talking about there is I just wanted to kind of explain where the oxygen is going. How do we get it in? What are the steps that it goes through? And then also, where is it being utilized and what is it being utilized for? And here's just a final example looking at the AVO2 difference. We see here at the lungs in the capillary beds of the alveoli, we have a partial pressure of oxygen of about 100 and a partial pressure of carbon dioxide of about 40. And now you're not going to need to remember these numbers, but you're going to need to remember the gist of what's occurring, okay? As it goes through the left ventricle of the heart rate, it's not getting to the muscles at all yet, so you're not utilizing any of the oxygen. But as it goes to the muscle, you get this diffusion. The muscle requires the oxygen, so it takes some of the oxygen, and it also has been producing CO2 because it has been working, so it's going to give up CO2. And now imagine the difference between this and exercise state and at rest. In an exercise state, are you going to be using more or less oxygen? You're going to be using more, right? And so in an exercise state, you're going to be drawing in more of this oxygen than you would at a resting state, as well as in an exercising state, are you going to be producing more or less carbon dioxide? You should know that in an exercising state, you're going to be producing more carbon dioxide. And so carbon dioxide diffusion is going to increase. And so we see here, this is just a number for reference, but we see here now the partial pressure of oxygen has gone from 100 that we see up here all the way down to 40, which makes sense. The oxygen has left the circulation and has gone into the muscle, as well as we see the carbon dioxide partial pressure, which was 40 up here, has now gone to 46. Okay, and this number is not universal. This is not the numbers that they always are. This is just used an example. Now, if you are working less hard, if you are at rest, the partial pressure of oxygen in your venous circuit might be something like 60. You're working less hard, you're drawing out less oxygen in the working muscle, and therefore the partial pressure of oxygen is not dropping as far. Or let's say you're working much harder. You're working at the peak of your VO2 max, the maximal ability of your body to consume oxygen. This partial pressure of oxygen might be something like 30. We might see the partial pressure of carbon dioxide go up to something like 50 or 55, okay? So it all depends on the needs of the muscle. The relative amount of oxygen in the blood is always pretty much the same. Just how much oxygen is being drawn out of the blood depends on how much the muscles require. So I hope this lecture was good for you guys. Stop my sharing. Hope this lecture was good for you guys. I'm essentially trying to give you guys a better rundown of the more important concepts, I believe, for understanding exercise. Some of these things might be a little physiology heavy, like you might be looking at the last lecture and going, okay, why do I need to know what bioenergetics are? Why do I need to know where the ATP is being produced and how prevalent each of those energy systems are at certain times? Those are going to be very useful for you for training, for nutrition, if you understand. If we think about long duration training uses a lot of muscle glycogen, that's probably going to differentiate or change how you are supplying nutrition or glucose to your body for those muscles. And so these things might seem a little bit arbitrary right now, but as you go forward in your education, as you understand how the body works, you can build off of these things and hopefully better understand how to provide prescription of exercise or therapy to somebody, okay? So I'm going to end the lecture right here. Hope you guys have a good day.